Protesters waved Ukrainian flags and called for unity. Authorities say Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden are planning to talk by telephone today as tensions over a possible invasion of Ukraine continue to escalate. The U.S. also announced plans to evacuate its embassy in the Ukrainian capital. Putin says he plans to speak with French President Emmanuel Macron, who he met with in Moscow earlier this week to try and resolve the crisis.
My family has always been prepared. We have all the stuff gathered for like a couple of years now. Honestly, I'm not afraid because the war wouldn't start like in a week. It's already been going for 8 years. Of course I'm worried, but am I afraid? Not. No, I don't think so.
Turning now to
he was taken from his home this afternoon in Cherokee County by Cameron Clark. That's his father. Clark does not have custody of his son. Right now, the GBI does not believe Nova is in any danger. We're told Clark is with his girlfriend, Malaysia Haynes, and may be headed to Minnesota with the baby. They're driving a dark red Nissan Altima with Mississippi tag LRC 5349. She disappeared from her home on Trammell Road in Morrow. Leah was last seen wearing light blue jeans, a black hoodie, and black slides. Her hair was tied in a bun. If you know where she might be, call Clayton County Police at 770-477-3550.
ability to pump, causing rapid or abnormal heart rhythms, or even...
And with that, lose your home. You have definitely infringed and denied on somebody's constitutional rights and freedoms.
Protests are expected to continue, although officials say restrictions will soon be rolled back. New tonight, Atlanta-based Delta Air.
I feel bad for the people who are legitimately hurting from the last 2 years, as we are. We've all suffered. What does freedom mean? What freedom do they want? In January and February, all the provincial governments and the federal government started to say that they will unlock things. They will open up things. This was already in the works. What they've done is actually shut it down. And they've certainly, thanks to their siege in Ottawa, given people less freedom. I have friends who live there. My nephew lives there. My entire family's in Ottawa. And they are living under siege, and they feel like it, and they are being harassed. So this is not about freedom. This is a right-wing movement to seize power.
If you're visiting a tiny village, Klong blockade, and demonstrators began leaving without resistance. Many demonstrators drove away from the Ambassador Bridge, spanning the river between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, as scores of police approached shortly after dawn. They had spent the night there in defiance of new warnings to end the blockade, which disrupted the flow of traffic and goods and forced the auto industry on both sides to roll back production. The protests have reverberated outside the country with similarly inspired convoys in France, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security warned that truck protests may be in the works in the United States as well. Meanwhile, its ability to pump, causing rapid or abnormal heart rhythms, or even protests held today across various UK cities were organized and coordinated by the People's Assembly, a political pressure group supported by various trade unions. Demonstrators marched in London, Manchester, and Edinburgh, among others, holding signs against rising fuel costs. One protester in London, speaking outside Westminster, said he is still relying on his parents to get by, as his wages are not enough to sustain him. Chris Neville, chair of the People's Assembly in Manchester, said the situation faced by citizens was an unprecedented one and defined it as a perfect storm of effects on working people. In more news out of
and there's no prospect of a U.S. military evacuation in the event of a Russian invasion. If a Russian attack on Ukraine proceeds, it is likely to begin with aerial bombing and missile attacks that could obviously kill civilians without regard to their nationality.
Russia continues to insist right now there will not be an invasion, but listen to this. Russia is telling its embassy staff in Kyiv to leave the city immediately, if that tells you anything. At the White House, David Spunt, Fox News.
Protesters waved Ukrainian flags and called for unity. Authorities say Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden are planning to talk by telephone today as tensions over a possible invasion of Ukraine continue to escalate. The U.S. also announced plans to evacuate its embassy in the Ukrainian capital. Putin says he plans to speak with French President Emmanuel Macron, who he met with in Moscow earlier this week to try and resolve the crisis.
My family has always been prepared. We have all the stuff gathered for like a couple of years now. Honestly, I'm not afraid because the war wouldn't start like in a week. It's already been going for 8 years. Of course, I'm worried, but am I afraid? Not. No, I don't think so.
Turning now to
the agreement was made or when it was supposed to be implemented. He added that a prisoner swap was being discussed in parallel with nuclear talks in Vienna. Last year, the State Department confirmed indirect but active talks with Iran over prisoners had been going on for some time. Iran and world leaders, including America, are discussing revival of a 2015 nuclear deal, although the talks remain inconclusive after months. Its ability to pump, causing rapid or abnormal heart rhythms, or even
that's a good thing about CBP is we're a 24/7 organization.
Federal officials say another concern surrounding large events such as the Super Bowl is a rise in human trafficking. That's why agents will also be tasked with inspecting all semi-trucks between now and game day. Still ahead on Fox 5 News Edge, President
and they share a border with 4 European Union countries. If Russia invades, millions of people could flee Ukraine into Europe. I mean, Europe saw a refugee crisis in 2015. This could dwarf that. So I understand the lack of Europe's interest in helping us out here because they are so energy dependent on Russia, but they could pay a price for that hesitancy.
All right, I want to get a quick thought from each of you on inflation. Some pretty big numbers this week showing 7.5%. It was the biggest jump that we've seen in U.S. inflation as a nation in 40 years. This is a reality for many American families. To you, Jerry, from the Wall Street Journal, what are we doing about this to bring these consumer prices down?
Well, first of all, it is a big hit to every family. There was a study that came out this week that we reported on that said the average family household suffers $276 a month in increased costs because of inflation right now. So this is real, and it's across the board. Everybody feels it. The difficult part for the Biden administration is there's not a lot in the short run that you can do about it. The one thing they can do, and some Democrats are urging, is do some more things to get the supply chains untangled, reduce pressure on at least one point that's adding to the inflationary spiral.
A lot of pressure is going to be on the Federal Reserve as well for their next move. Joanna, a quick thought from you on inflation. You've got these massive price hikes, but yet this White House is still pushing its spending bill, trying to do so at least, across the finish line.
Look, I agree with Jerry that one president is not responsible for inflation, and we are still feeling the effects from closing the global economy in March 2020. I think President Biden is doing everything he can to address it. And just going back really quickly on the point of President Biden being responsible for Putin's aggression, President Trump actually undermined our intelligence agencies to Putin. So I think a lot of blame is there. I think we as Americans need to come together and focus on our next 100-year strategy for American dominance.
Okay, Jason.
Great to see you, Sandra.
So your state has not had a statewide mask mandate since last year. In December, you said, quote, the emergency is over, and have left the mandate decisions up to local officials. This week, we saw a number of Democratic governors follow your lead. However, the White House has a different take, as well as some other Democratic governors. Take a look at what the president said this week.
I committed that I would follow the science as put forward by the CDC and the federal people. And I think it's probably premature, but it's a tough call.
So, Governor, does the assaults are up 34%, robberies are up 15%. You've said that your goal for Colorado is to become a top 10 safest state in America, and you've introduced the Public Safety Plan of Action to hopefully reach that goal. However, the Colorado Fraternal Order of Police and County Sheriffs of Colorado, they're not embracing your plan. They're citing concerns of anti-law enforcement sentiment. How do you plan to bridge the gap between your plan and law enforcement to combat these rising crime rates in your state, sir?
First of all, many police chiefs and sheriffs are fully supportive of our plan because our plan fundamentally invests in helping recruit and retain law enforcement. We have sheriff's departments, police departments that are at 70-80% of capacity because they've had early retirements. They can't successfully recruit and train, and we need to support and help to make sure that we have the police on the ground that we need to protect our families in Colorado and make our state one of the safest. In addition to that, we need investments in behavioral health, in diversion, in making sure that we can prevent crimes before they occur by having youth intervention programs and programs within our prison walls to prevent recidivism when people have served their term and get released. So it's a comprehensive, thoughtful approach. Law enforcement is a big part of it, but there's a lot more to it. If crime was a simple issue, it would have been solved. So we're committed to listening to police chiefs, sheriffs, and experts from across the country to really have a data-driven plan to make Colorado one of the safest states.
Governor, thank you very much for joining us.
North, known for their friendliness, are exercising the kind of rebelliousness usually associated with Americans. I wish more Americans were adopting this civil disobedience attitude that the truckers have. But I think the larger message here is that even Canadians are fed up with this emergency COVID nonsense, it's time to end. It's time to end these mandates, and it's not just in Canada. We're seeing it in Europe, in Brussels. We're seeing it in New Zealand, and people want their freedom back. And I think that's the message being sent. Even at the provincial level in Canada, Justin Trudeau is seeing pushback from members of his own party on these mandates. So I think it's time to rethink them.
Yeah, to that point, we are seeing these start to pop up in New Zealand. There's a convoy protest happening in France where police had to be deployed to fire tear gas to disperse some of the crowds there. But truckers in the U.S. are now, Joanna, potentially planning their own convoys. As we mentioned, this seems to be spreading. Now with the possibility of gridlock and traffic in several major U.S. cities ahead of the State of the Union address, what would a Biden administration, from your view, what should their response look like to that?
Look, I think you have to be consistent that shutting down traffic is not okay with a protest. And look, we've seen a number of protests shut down traffic. And it's interesting to me when the right and the left say they're okay with one side and not the other. No one should shut down traffic. And the truth is, when these, protesters have a problem with the president and the president's mandate, they're actually taking it out on the people. And so the American people would be the ones to suffer. So I really hope that this doesn't happen. I hope the Biden administration takes a strong stance and that state and local governments are given the resources that they need to prevent any shutdowns that will impact average Americans. I think the bigger issue is always political polarization of a pandemic, and that, by even virtue of us having this conversation, continues, and we need to all take a step back, listen to exactly what we need to do to come together, overcome this pandemic, and move forward together.
Listening's always good. We'll see if the country is able to do that.
Its ability to pump, causing rapid or abnormal heart rhythms, or even triple vaccinated. Charles had previously contracted the coronavirus in March of 2020 during the first wave of the pandemic. Charles is believed to have met with his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, early last week when both were at Windsor Castle. Buckingham Palace hasn't said whether the 95-year-old Queen has tested positive, though it said last week she was not displaying symptoms.
Says an APD officer shot a woman who had allegedly stabbed 2 people. According to their initial report, the woman ignored the officer's instructions and approached the officer with the knife.
Really, unfortunately, it's not abnormal for Georgia. In 2021, we closed out the year investigating 100 officer-involved shootings.
We spoke with Nellie Miles, the spokesperson for the GBI. She says many of the incidents are shootouts.
Someone from the public is asking for their assistance, and when they get there, they are engaged in a gun battle, and the officer prevails.
Miles says other law enforcement agencies call them in for a completely independent review of the officer's actions.
These cases are not internal cases or internal investigations. They are criminal investigations.
And looking at the data from 2021, Miles says many of the incidents share very common themes.
What really stood out to me was that there was a pattern of police officers being called to domestic incidents, that we did have a lot of cases where there appeared to be someone who was suffering from a mental health crisis.
Coming up next on News Edge at 11, we'll talk about what happens when the GBI completes its investigation. For now, in Atlanta, Rob DiRienzo, Fox.
another person was stabbed in the arm. Detectives say they then responded to 2 other stabbing calls later that afternoon near an apartment complex. Police say yet another call came in about someone being stabbed at a convenience store. Medics rushed every one of those victims to area hospitals. Investigators say 2 victims are still in critical condition. They say the victims have seemed to have been targeted randomly.
If somebody blows your doors off and you hope there's a cop ahead, that's what we're doing. We're going to be that cop.
The Morrow Police Department reported nearly 1,100 motor vehicle crashes in 2021, including 95 that involved injuries and 3 fatalities. Just last month, a 19-year-old woman and her unborn child were killed when police say a drunk driver barreled through a red light here at the intersection of Morrow Road and Jonesboro Road.
It was a driver that was DUI. He slammed into the passenger side of the compact vehicle. She was the passenger. She was 7 months pregnant at the time.
The department's Strategic Traffic Enforcement and Enhanced Response Initiative is made up of officers from every division of the police department, tripling the number of officers patrolling Morrow for Friday's operation, which targeted violators in the vicinity of I-75 and Jonesboro Road. The team will focus on crash and injury-causing behaviors, including drunk and drugged driving, speeding, distracted driving, and seatbelt and child restraint law violations. The police department publicized this effort well in advance of the day's operation and puts drivers on notice that this is one of many more to come. In Morrow.
Its ability to pump, causing rapid